Imagine being handed, a golden ticket, like a literal, guaranteed mechanism to save your entire country's economy from the absolute worst depression in human history.
Right. The ultimate lifeline.
Exactly. And you finally deploy this mechanism, and to everyone's massive relief, it actually works. It works miracles. Factories spin back up, money flows, people are buying cars again.
It's the dream scenario, really.
Yeah. But then, just 9 months later, you watch your own leaders voluntarily shred that golden ticket into confetti. They simply tear it up, and they plunge the entire nation right back into the dark.
It sounds like, like a dark comedy, because no rational administration would ever sabotage their own escape route like that.
It is totally counterintuitive, but that is exactly what happened. Today on The Deep Dive, we are opening up a perfectly preserved historical disaster. We are going back to the 1930s, specifically to the French Great Depression.
Oh, this is such a fascinating era.
It really is. We are going to look at how a perfectly well-intentioned a policy specifically designed to save the working class and mandate a better life, accidentally triggered a catastrophic economic stagflation.
And it remains one of the most stunning historical mysteries of modern economics. Like, why did the French political apparatus essentially crush their own hard-won recovery?
We have a massive mission ahead of us today. We're dusting off an incredibly rigorous, just brilliantly argued academic study by 3 scholars, Jérémie Cohen-Setton, Joshua K. Hausman, and Johannes F. Wieland.
Right, and they represent UC Berkeley, the University of Michigan, and UC San Diego.
Yeah, heavy hitters.
Very. And what these 3 researchers have accomplished here is, well, it's nothing short of phenomenal. They managed to completely bypass the muddy, aggregated national statistics that economists usually just argue over endlessly.
Because those numbers are always so messy, right?
Exactly. Instead, they dug up raw 80-year-old microdata. We are talking about microscopic factory-level data that has literally been sitting in the dark for decades.
And when you bring that data into the light, it does something amazing. It slaps modern textbook economics right in the face.
It really does.
For those of you listening, you might think macroeconomics is just dry math, just complex formulas floating around in an ivory tower somewhere. But today, you are going to see how a boring bureaucratic schedule like the literal timeline of when a law took effect became the ultimate smoking gun in a massive economic murder mystery.
And the victim, of course, being the entire French industrial recovery. The evidence they present here completely dismantles the mainstream economic models that central banks use, at this very moment.
Wow.
Yeah. It proves that administrative supply restrictions, things like forcibly shrinking the work week by law and mandating nationwide wage hikes, they didn't save the economy. They acted as a slow-acting, paralyzing poison.
So to understand the sheer scale of this tragedy, we really had to start at the bottom. We need to go back to the early 1930s and sort of stand on the edge of what we can call the French abyss.
Okay, let's set the stage.
Give us the landscape of the world at that exact moment.
So put yourself in the global context of the early 1930s. The entire industrialized world is basically drowning in the Great Depression. The stock market has crashed, banks have completely failed, and unemployment is skyrocketing everywhere.
Right, it's bleak.
Very bleak. But different nations are testing different lifesavers.
And the United Kingdom makes the first really major move in 1931. They bail on the gold standard.
Exactly. They completely sever the link between the British pound and physical gold. And then the United States follows suit shortly after, in 1933, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By dropping the gold standard, they allow their currencies to just instantly devalue.
Let's actually pause and explain the mechanics of that, because dropping the gold standard sounds like, a dusty history term. But it is the literal physical engine of the economy. When your currency is tied to gold, you are physically restricted, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Imagine the central bank as an engine. The gold standard is a physical governor on that engine. If the law says every paper dollar or franc must be backed by a specific physical ounce of gold sitting in a vault somewhere, you cannot print more paper money unless you physically acquire more gold.
So if your country is in a depression and people are terrified and hoarding money or pulling their gold out of the banks, your money supply physically shrinks.
Precisely. You can't lend, you can't stimulate, you are just totally trapped in this deflationary death spiral.
But the moment the UK and the US cut that tether, they got control of their engines back.
Right. They could print money, they could lend, they could just flood their economies with liquidity. And because their currencies were devalued, their goods suddenly became much cheaper on the international market.
Because it costs less for other countries to buy their stuff.
Exactly. And almost immediately, they both began to recover. They basically grabbed a lifeboat and started rowing to safety.
Okay, so Britain and America are rowing away. France, however, looks at those lifeboats and essentially says, no thank you.
Yeah. France is the stubborn European powerhouse here. They absolutely refuse to let go of the gold standard. They cling to it like a religious artifact.
Why? Why were they so stubborn?
Well, they were absolutely terrified of the hyperinflation that had just destroyed Germany a decade earlier. They thought strong money was the only honorable path.
And the economic consequences of that stubbornness were simply brutal.
Beyond brutal. Because they remained tied to gold while all their trading partners devalued, French goods became astronomically expensive on the global market. Nobody wanted to buy French exports.
The data point the authors highlight here is just staggering to me. Real GDP in France crashed for 6 straight years. From 1930 all the way to 1936, they wiped out 15% of their entire economy.
Just poof.
Gone. And industrial production hit rock bottom, briefly bounced back slightly, and then plummeted to hit rock bottom again in 1935. It was a double-dip nightmare.
Put yourself in the shoes of a French citizen during this. A 15% drop in the size of the whole economy.
To give that some context for you listening, the 2008 global financial crisis saw U.S. GDP drop by around 4%. So we are talking about nearly 4 times that level of devastation dragging on year after year.
It's like being trapped on a sinking ship in the pitch dark, watching your British and American allies row away to prosperity while your own leaders insist that staying on the sinking deck is the only honorable choice.
Man, that is bleak. And the societal anxiety wasn't just economic, was it? It was fracturing the entire political foundation of the country.
Oh, absolutely. Between 1929 and 1934, France cycled through 12 different prime ministers.
Wait, 12 prime ministers in 5 years?
Yes, that is a new leader every few months. Complete institutional chaos. You had violent street demonstrations, far-right leagues, and far-left communist factions were literally physically clashing in the streets of Paris.
So people were entirely losing faith in the democratic capitalist system.
The despair was absolute, which perfectly sets the stage for a massive, unprecedented political gamble.
Right. May 1936, the nation goes to the polls.
And a coalition called the Popular Front wins the national election. It's this broad left-wing alliance led by Léon Blum. And their entire platform is built on a vow to save the downtrodden, to fundamentally restructure society, and to rescue the working class from this unending misery.
But the moment they win, before Léon Blum even officially takes office, the country absolutely explodes.
It wasn't a transition of power, it was an eruption. 1.2 million workers go on a wildcat strike.
Just out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere. And they don't just walk out, they occupy the factories.
Right.
Over 12,000 separate strikes paralyze the nation.
Picture the Renault automobile plants outside Paris. Tens of thousands of workers simply stop the assembly lines, lock the doors, and set up camp inside the factories.
Yeah.
They're playing accordions, sleeping on the factory floor, and basically refusing to leave until their lives fundamentally change.
And the factory owners were absolutely terrified. Many of them thought a full-blown Bolshevik revolution was unfolding right in front of their eyes. The entire industrial capacity of France just dropped to zero overnight.
So the incoming government is terrified too. They have to stop the bleeding immediately. So in June 1936, they bring the labor unions and the factory owners to the prime minister's residence and hammer out what becomes known as the Matignon Agreements.
And these agreements were a massive, sweeping victory for labor. I mean, they granted 2 weeks of paid vacation for the first time in French history. They mandated immediate wage hikes across the board, ranging from 7 to 15%.
And then the big one.
Yeah.
The absolute crown jewel of the Popular Front's platform. They mandated a hard cut to the legal work week. They dropped it from 48 hours down to 40 hours.
But crucially, and this is the detail that changes everything, they added a legal stipulation. This reduction in hours could not result in any loss of weekly pay.
Wow. So the streets of Paris basically erupted in celebration. It looked like the ultimate victory for the working class. They had fought the factory bosses and won.
It really felt like a massive transfer of wealth and leisure time directly to the workers, like a complete rewriting of the social contract.
But, if we look closely at the underlying physics of this policy, we find a hidden, fatal price tag. Let's explore the core logic of this 40-hour law, because the rationale behind it is actually fascinating.
Yeah, the Popular Front was operating on a very specific, highly intuitive macroeconomic assumption. They looked at the massive unemployment lines and thought they saw a mathematical solution.
Okay, walk us through their thought process here, because if you have massive unemployment and you have the currently employed people working 48 hours a week.
Their theory was incredibly simple: share the work. If we pass a national law forcing everyone to only work 40 hours, the factories still have the exact same number of orders to fill. The machinery still needs to run.
Ah, okay. So by creating this artificial gap of 8 hours per worker, the companies will basically have no choice. They will be forced to go out into the street and hire all the unemployed people to make up the missing labor.
That's the idea.
It sounds like mathematical magic.
It is incredibly appealing rhetoric. You reduce the hours of the overworked, you force the hiring of the unemployed, and you cure the depression in one massive legislative stroke.
And remember the stipulation we mentioned? The law explicitly stated your weekly paycheck could not shrink. So you work a full day less every single week, but you take home the exact same envelope of cash on Friday.
Mathematically, what that means is that the hourly wage just shot up.
Let's actually do the math on that.
Yeah.
If you're getting paid the same amount of money for 20% less time, your hourly wage just spiked by an astronomical 20%. Instantly. Plus the 7 to 15% baseline raise they also mandated.
Right, so for the employer, the cost of labor per hour just skyrocketed.
Wait, let's play devil's advocate here. The government just passed a law that essentially says, work less, get paid the same, and unemployment will magically vanish because companies will have to hire more. Is there really such a flawless, magical antidote to a severe economic depression? Can you just legislate a free lunch and expect the laws of physics to bend?
Well, that is the pivotal question of the entire study, because reality, as the authors demonstrate so clearly, hit back. And it hit back in the form of a ruthless zero-sum game.
Let's look at the charts the researchers pulled from the archives. The nominal wages, like the actual numbers printed on the workers' paychecks, they spiked. When you look at the graph of wages in 1936, it looks like a near vertical line.
It really does.
The researchers actually note this is a sheer anomaly in human economic history.
Right.
Wages just went straight up like a rocket.
And for a brief, intoxicating moment, the workers felt incredibly rich. They had more money in their pockets and way more free time.
But there is an inescapable twist. Businesses suddenly faced a 20% or even 30% spike in their labor costs basically overnight. What do? Put yourself in the shoes of a factory owner who is already barely surviving a 6-year depression.
Exactly. They cannot simply absorb a 30% cost increase out of their profit margins, because in 1936, those margins were already razor thin, if not completely non-existent.
Right.
They have to survive, so they do the only thing a business actually can do in that situation. They raise their prices immediately.
So prices exploded across France. Inflation reared its ugly head and completely devoured those wage hikes.
The authors point out a fundamental misunderstanding by the Popular Front here. The government sincerely hoped to raise wages and simultaneously lower prices by stimulating consumer demand. They thought, hey, paying workers more would mean workers buy more, which creates economies of scale.
But that's not how supply works.
No, supply curves slope upward. When your core input costs go up by 20%, you cannot lower your prices. You are forced to raise them just to avoid bankruptcy.
Let's bring this down to the street level for you listening, just to drive home the brutal irony. Imagine you are a worker in late 1936. You marched in the streets. You occupied the factory. You won the strike. You get your new fat paycheck. But when you walk down to the local market, the milk, the bread, the meat, the coal to heat your home,
Yeah.
it has all surged in price.
Yeah, the data on real purchasing power, which measures what your money can actually physically buy, shows a truly tragic arc. It briefly ticked upward for a month or two, but then as the aggressive inflation caught up, real purchasing power violently collapsed back down.
It's completely devastating. You get the biggest raise of your life, but you end up poorer at the grocery store.
And this specific dynamic brings us to a really crucial historical comparison, because very frequently in modern debates, people will compare Leon Blum's 1936 French experiment to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States.
Oh, you hear this constantly. Well, FDR did massive government intervention. He supported labor, and it pulled America out of the Depression. People use it as blanket proof that government intervention always works.
Right. But the researchers in this paper are extremely explicit in dismantling that comparison. We really need to clarify the massive mechanical difference between what America did and what France did.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of the two approaches. Let's look under the hood.
The United States, under FDR, did implement some hours restrictions under the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, but the nature of those restrictions was vastly different. They were largely voluntary codes, negotiated industry by industry. They were much milder, and frankly, many of them were struck down by the Supreme Court shortly after anyway.
But more importantly, what was FDR doing to the rest of the economy while that was happening?
He was engaging in massive, unprecedented demand expansion. He took the U.S. off the gold standard in 1933. He devalued the dollar. The Federal Reserve expanded the money supply.
Oh, right.
The government engaged in a massive deficit spending on public works. They flooded the economy with liquidity.
So using our engine metaphor, FDR just stumped on the gas pedal. He pumped oxygen into the room. He created huge demand.
Yes. France, conversely, was still shackled to the gold standard when they passed these massive labor laws. They were not printing money. They were not expanding demand. They simply applied an iron-fisted, rigid, administrative chokehold on the supply of labor.
Wow. So FDR is giving the American economy a massive blood transfusion of new money, while Bloom is basically putting a tourniquet around the neck of the French supply chain.
It entirely comes down to the difference between stimulating demand and restricting supply. But then, a few months later, something huge shifts. September 1936, France finally caves.
The pressure just simply became unbearable, right?
Yeah. The Bank of France's gold reserves were bleeding out as capital fled the country. They just could not hold the line anymore. So they abandoned the gold standard. They devalue the franc.
They finally take the golden ticket. They do exactly what Britain and America did years earlier. And what happens?
The initial reaction is a textbook miracle. It works exactly as it should. The M2 money supply surges. The Bank of France lowers the discount rate, which makes borrowing cheaper. Industrial production suddenly rockets upward.
Unemployment starts to fall. People are actually buying cars again. The devaluation is an immediate, massive success. The engine finally gets some fuel.
We call this the 9-month illusion.
Wait, why an illusion?
Because by June 1937, this massive, beautiful, desperate boom is completely dead.
Dead. Just gone. French industrial output crashes right back into the abyss. It drops all the way back to the miserable levels it was at before they even devalued the currency.
The entire recovery is entirely erased in less than a year.
Okay, we have to stop and ask the obvious question here. They finally took the textbook medicine. The currency devaluation worked beautifully at first. It proved that it could save them. How on earth did the French economy get the life sucked out of it in just 9 months? Who or what killed the recovery?
To answer that question, to find the real killer, we have to move away from the big macroeconomic headlines and look at the dust-covered microscopic data. And this is where the authors of the study truly become the heroes of our deep dive.
The problem with macro statistics like the big national GDP numbers is that they blur everything together.
Right. Imagine looking down at a massive chaotic crowd from an airplane at 30,000 feet. You can see the crowd generally moving left or right, but you have no idea why. You can't see who is pushing whom.
So when you just see French national GDP drop in 1937, you don't know the cause. Defenders of the Popular Front could easily say, well, it was the ongoing strikes, or it was the fear of Nazi Germany rearming next door, causing capital fight.
Exactly. When you only look at the aggregate, literally any narrative can seem plausible. So these researchers decided to bypass the messy national statistics altogether. They dug into the archives and uncovered an incredibly precise, entirely forgotten microdata set. It was originally compiled in 1937 by a brilliant French statistician named Alfred Sauvy.
Just think about the sheer effort of doing this in 1937. There were no Excel spreadsheets, no computers.
No, Sauvy meticulously hand-collected monthly production indices for 22 specific industrial sectors. We are talking about granular month-by-month data on coal, steel, textiles, leather, chemicals, paper, building materials, detail by agonizing detail.
So instead of looking at the country from an airplane, the researchers put a high-powered microscope over 22 specific assembly lines. And when you isolate the variables like that, the murderer is caught completely red-handed.
The microdata reveals exactly what happened, and it all revolves around what we can call the causal trap.
Oh, explain the mechanics of this trap, because this is the absolute smoking gun of the paper.
The 40-hour workweek law, the Matignon Agreement, did not drop on the entire French economy on the exact same day. It wasn't just a single light switch that Leon Blum flipped in Paris.
Wait, why not? If it's a national law, why doesn't everyone just start working 40 hours on Monday?
Because implementing it was an absolute bureaucratic nightmare. The government mandated that every single industry had to undergo complex, formal labor negotiations before the decree could take legal effect in that specific sector. They had to conduct workplace surveys. Government bureaucrats had to sit down with the distinct labor unions and the distinct factory owners in coal, and then do it all over again in textiles and then again in chemicals.
Ah, I see. So it's not a bomb going off all at once. It's a slow-moving administrative poison creeping through the economy sector by sector.
Precisely. The negotiations for coal and metallurgy wrapped up quickly, so they got hit with the 40-hour limit in November 1936. But the textile industry negotiations dragged on, so they didn't get hit until January 1937. Chemicals had to wait until March 1937.
And because this staggered rollout is based purely on boring, delayed, bureaucratic schedules, it accidentally hands modern economists a perfect, uncontaminated scientific experiment.
Yeah, in economics, this is basically the holy grail. It is called a quasi-natural experiment. The timing of when the law hit an industry had absolutely nothing to do with how well that industry was performing, or how scared they were of Germany, or whether they were experiencing capital flight. It depended entirely on how long the lawyers and bureaucrats took to argue in a conference room in Paris.
Wow. So we know the exact month, down to the day, that each specific victim drank the poison.
And the statistical regression the authors ran on this data is ironclad. They isolated the exact moment the hours restriction was applied to each of the 22 industries, controlling for all other macro trends.
So what did the computer spit out when they ran Solvy's numbers?
They found that in the exact month the 40-hour limit became law in a specific industry, that industry's output instantly plummeted by 5.7%.
Instantly. Like the same month.
Immediately. And that 5.7% drop wasn't a blip. It was followed by a severe ongoing contraction. The law just wrapped around the production line and kept squeezing the life out of it.
Put yourself in the visceral reality of this moment. Just imagine the workers in a French textile plant in January 1937. The bureaucratic decree finally comes down. The law passes for them. They are cheering. They pack up their tools, they wash their hands, and they walk out of the factory early on a Friday afternoon. They go home to their families to celebrate their newly won leisure time, feeling like they have finally conquered the system.
Yeah, but they were completely unaware that the assembly lines behind them were grinding to a permanent halt.
They thought they won the war against the bosses, but they actually just legislated the shutdown of their own livelihood.
Because the businesses simply couldn't cope with the math. Facing a sudden, massive spike in labor costs for the exact same amount of weekly output, businesses had no choice. They had to shift the burden to the market.
Let's talk about cost shifting for a second.
So the researchers analyzed the price data for the goods produced by these specific industries. They found that the relative prices for the goods in a given sector spiked by 5 to 6% the very moment the 40-hour law hit that sector.
So the day the textile workers leave early, the cost of a bolt of French cloth shoots up 6%.
Exactly. And when your prices shoot up that fast, your export competitiveness is instantly destroyed. I mean, nobody in Britain or America or Switzerland wants to buy French steel or French textiles if they are suddenly drastically more expensive than the domestic alternatives.
Which totally strips away the entire benefit of the currency devaluation. They devalued the franc in September to make French goods cheaper abroad. But then, month by month, the 40-hour law rolled through the economy, making those same goods instantly more expensive again.
The supply restriction completely neutralized the demand cure.
It is such a profound tragedy. Let's just highlight this counterintuitive reality for a second. A sweeping welfare law designed exclusively by a left-wing government to protect, uplift, and enrich vulnerable workers mutated into a ruthless economic machine that exploited both the workers and the consumers. It destroyed the jobs it was meant to share.
It really did. And this historical tragedy brings us to the second, perhaps even more fascinating part of the study, the theoretical defeat, the ivory tower playbook. Because this paper doesn't just slap the 1930s politicians in the face. It turns around and slaps modern 21st century economists right in the face.
The academic face slap. I love this part. To understand this, we really need to introduce the reigning champion of modern macroeconomic theory, the model that essentially rules the world today.
We are talking about the new Keynesian DSGE model.
Okay, DSGE.
Yeah.
What does that even stand for?
Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium.
Okay, that sounds intensely intimidating.
It is extremely complex math. It involves massive matrices of equations running on supercomputers. But we don't need the jargon. We can understand the core logic, which is taught as gospel in pretty much every Ivy League economics class today, and serves as the golden rule for how central banks like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank operate.
What is this golden rule? Walk us through the logic.
So the rule governs what happens to an economy when interest rates are stuck at zero. This is called the zero lower bound, and it happens during severe depressions or recessions when central banks cut rates to zero to try and stimulate borrowing.
Okay, so money is virtually free to borrow.
The DSGE model dictates that in this specific zero-interest environment, any policy that restricts the supply of goods, like a war, a pandemic, or in our case, cutting work hours, will inevitably cause people to expect higher inflation.
Let's actually trace that logic step by step. If you restrict the supply of labor by capping hours, fewer goods get made.
Right.
If fewer goods are made, things get scarce. If things get scarce, prices will go up. So consumers look at the factory operating hours and rationally expect inflation tomorrow.
Correct. Now, put yourself in the mindset of a rational consumer or a rational entrepreneur in the model. If you know for an absolute fact that a machine or a car or a building is going to cost 20% more next year because of expected inflation, what do you do today?
I rush out and buy it today. If I hold my money in the bank at 0% interest, but inflation is going to be 10%, my money is actively losing value. The real interest rate is mathematically negative. So it literally pays me to spend money right now before prices rise.
Exactly. So according to the mathematical perfection of the new Keynesian model, restricting supply at zero interest rates should trigger a massive nationwide spending boom today. Consumers will rush to buy, businesses will rush to invest in inventory before costs rise, and that massive wave of spending will act as a stimulus that saves the economy from the depression.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this right. The modern cutting-edge economic theory says that Leon Blum's 40-hour work week, which we just saw empirically destroy the French recovery, should have been the greatest economic stimulus of all time.
Yes. The model interprets a negative supply shock as a powerful expansionary force.
How is that possible? Why did the Ivy League inflation expectation savior utterly fail when it met the cold, hard reality of the 1930s French Depression?
Well, to prove exactly how badly the model fails, the authors of the study did something brilliant. They designed an absurd simulation.
They actually fed the 1930s data into the modern matrix.
Yes. They took the actual raw French microdata, the 20% wage hikes, the staggered rollout across the 22 industries, the fixed interest rates, and they fed it all into the parameters of this perfectly respected, universally accepted DSGE model. They asked the computer, based on your rules, what should have happened to France?
And what did the computer spit out?
The model calculated that, driven by this massive wave of expected inflation, French output should have magically skyrocketed.
By how much? Give me the number.
The model predicted that the French economy should have expanded by an absurd 150%.
Wait. Stop. Perfect academic math predicts a miraculous 150% boom. It predicts the French economy will more than double in size simply because they forced everyone to work less.
Yes. The mathematical equations literally draw a line shooting straight up into prosperity.
But the history books, the actual photographs of bread lines, the microdata of factories shutting down.
Yeah.
Reality shows a suffocating, miserable depression. Yeah. Complete collapse. Predicting a 150% boom when reality was a brutal contraction isn't just a rounding error. That is a fundamental, catastrophic detachment from how human beings actually behave.
The model didn't just get the nuance wrong. It got the fundamental direction of reality entirely backward.
Why? How can the smartest economists in the world build a model that is this catastrophically wrong?
Because the model is built on a fatal assumption about human nature.
What is the assumption?
Why did the model hallucinate a boom? Because it assumes humans are perfectly rational, emotionless, calculating robots.
It's a classic economist joke. Assume a frictionless vacuum.
Basically, the model assumes prices are perfectly flexible and can change instantly without consequence. And crucially, it assumes that when inflation looms on the horizon, an entrepreneur will sit back, calmly do the math, notice the negative real interest rate, and say, prices are rising. I will happily and instantly borrow 1 million francs and build 3 more factories today to capitalize on tomorrow's higher prices.
Right, because in a spreadsheet, if money is cheap to borrow and the prices of goods are rising, Investing in production is the logically optimal move.
But look at the reality of 1936 France. Look at the actual humans.
These French entrepreneurs were terrified. They weren't sitting in a quiet office looking at spreadsheets. They were looking out their windows at 1.2 million angry, striking workers occupying their assembly line.
Exactly. They were facing paralyzing nationwide strikes. They were facing massive, rigid legal hurdles to changing their prices. The government literally threatened to impose national price controls in August 1936 to stop the inflation.
So the factory owner isn't calmly thinking, oh, I should expand my capacity to capture tomorrow's inflation. He is thinking, I might lose my business. My property might be seized by a communist revolution, and I might lose my life. I am just trying to survive the week.
Precisely. They weren't building factories. They were hoarding physical gold, smuggling their wealth to Switzerland, and praying.
The human element.
Wow.
Fear, uncertainty, institutional friction. The mathematical model completely ignores all of it. It assumes a friction-free universe.
But the researchers, and this is what makes it so robust, they didn't just stop there.
They ran a robustness check, right?
Yeah.
Did they try to tweak the model to make it fit reality?
They tried everything. And this is what makes the paper so devastatingly conclusive. They bent over backward to give the model a chance. They tweaked the parameters. They added severe wage rigidities. They added imperfect, sticky consumer expectations. They tried adding complex habit formation variables for consumers.
They basically gave the mathematical model every possible excuse to get the history right.
And it simply did not matter. No matter how they tortured the math, no matter what friction they added, the core architecture of the new Keynesian model always predicted an insane, impossible boom in response to a supply restriction at zero interest rates.
So what does that mean for us? What is the ultimate conclusion of that simulation?
The conclusion is severe. The core mechanism of the reigning economic model, the very compass that central banks use right now to navigate recessions, is systematically biased and completely broken when it comes to analyzing supply shocks in a low-interest environment.
That is a deeply chilling thought. If our society's ultimate decision-making compass is broken at its core, are the economic structural cures we prescribe today actually just slow-acting poison?
It is a question that every single policymaker relying on these models has to confront.
Okay, but we have to be absolutely fair to history here. We have to eliminate the noise. What do the defenders of the Popular Front say? Because people definitely still write books defending Leon Blum's labor policies today.
Of course they do. Defenders of the policy look at the 1937 crash and point to literally everything else that was going wrong in the world. They say, no, it wasn't the 40-hour work week that killed the recovery. It was the massive strikes. It was the terror of Adolf Hitler rapidly rearming next door in Germany. It was a coordinated campaign of capital flight by greedy, unpatriotic rich people.
Which, honestly, on its face, sounds totally reasonable. If I am running a factory in France in 1937 and Hitler is saber-rattling right across the border, I'm probably not investing in a new 10-year expansion plan either.
It sounds perfectly reasonable until you apply logical deduction and look at the actual timeline. And the authors of this paper logically dismantle every single one of these alibis.
Okay, eliminate the suspects for me. How do they do it?
First, let's look at the sheer scale of the math. To cancel out the theoretical 150% massive boom that the model dictates the 40-hour law should have created, those alternative fears, the fear of war, the strikes, would have to be absolutely apocalyptic. They would have to be negative shocks so gargantuan that they entirely wipe out a 150% expansion and drag it down into a severe depression. There is simply no empirical historical evidence of a psychological shock of that magnitude.
Okay, that covers the theoretical scale. But what about the actual historical timeline?
That is the second and far more damning piece of evidence. Remember when France finally devalued its currency in September 1936?
Right, the 9-month illusion. Output shot up immediately.
But think about the broader context of those 9 months. During that massive sudden boom in late 1936, the strikes were still happening. The political chaos of the Popular Front was still raging. The existential fear of Nazi Germany was still absolutely terrifying.
Oh, well, I see where you're going with this. If the strikes and the fear of war were the true murderers killing the economy, why did the economy manage to boom so aggressively in late 1936 while all those factors were fully present?
Exactly. The economy empirically proved that it could grow despite all that political noise and geopolitical terror as long as it had proper demand stimulus from the devalued currency.
So if you eliminate the noise, if you clear away the smoke of geopolitics and street protests, Only one suspect is left standing in the room holding the murder weapon.
The administrative restriction of hours. The 40-hour law. It is the only variable that aligns perfectly, month by month, sector by sector, with the timeline of the collapse across all 22 of Savi's industries.
It is just brilliant detective work. But before we look at how the French finally escaped this trap, we have to talk about the absolute most mind-bending part of this paper. The researchers dive into an appendix to show us just how absurd the modern economic model truly is. Let's talk about the strike absurdity.
This is perhaps the most fascinating, just head-scratching mathematical quirk of the entire deep dive. In the appendix of the paper, the authors dig deep into the foundational math of the new Keynesian DSGE model to see how it handles the concept of a worker strike.
How do you even mathematically model a guy with a picket sign refusing to work?
Well, in the matrix of the model, you code it as a decrease in the willingness to supply labor. It is treated mathematically as a pure supply shock.
Okay, that makes logical sense.
But then, the authors follow the equations to their natural conclusion. They prove mathematically that, according to the model's rigid logic, strikes have the exact same macroeconomic effect as the 40-hour law.
Wait, because they both technically restrict the total supply of labor.
Yes. Let's walk the model's logic path again. A massive strike restricts the supply of goods. Because goods are now scarce, the model assumes prices will rise tomorrow.
Expected inflation.
Right. Because of expected inflation, the real interest rate drops below zero. Because the real interest rate is negative, rational consumers and businesses rush out to borrow and spend their money today before prices rise.
Which creates a massive surge in demand, which looks like a booming economy.
Which means the model literally dictates that the more your workers strike, the more they paralyze your factories and refuse to work. The more prosperous, expansive, and booming your national economy will become.
That is completely undeniably insane. It defies every shred of common sense. You cannot build a utopia by having everyone refuse to produce anything.
It is a profound theoretical irony. It exposes how deeply flawed our fundamental understanding of supply shocks can be when we only look at mathematical equations and completely ignore human behavior and the physical reality of production.
So how does this historical nightmare actually end? France is suffocating. The Popular Front's dream has turned into a stagflationary nightmare.
We reach the final reversal. Fast forward to November 1938.
So we are over 2 years after the 40-hour law goes into effect.
And the French government is pushed to the absolute brink. The economy is in ruins. The geopolitical situation with Germany is no longer just a fear. It is becoming a terrifyingly imminent reality. France desperately needs to produce weapons, steel, tanks, and airplanes to defend itself. They realize they simply cannot afford the luxury of having their industrial base sitting idle for 3 days a week.
Survival finally outweighs ideology. What do?
A new government, led by Prime Minister Edouard Daladier, finally caves to reality. They make the agonizing political decision to completely abolish Léon Blum's core political legacy.
They scrap the 40-hour limit.
They dismantle it entirely. They officially return the country to a flexible 48-hour workweek. They basically remove the rigid administrative chokehold from the throat of French industry.
And what happens to the economy? Do they inject a massive new package of stimulus? Do they print more money or devalue the franc again?
No. That is the most incredible part. Without injecting a single franc of new stimulus, without printing any more money, without any grand new government spending program.
It's untying the rope.
Just untying the rope. The actual hours worked by the French labor force instantly rebounded, and industrial production shot up in a massive, aggressive, textbook V-shaped recovery.
It's like a suffocating patient springing up from a hospital bed the very second you take the pillow off their face.
Yeah. Just by removing the administrative restriction on the supply side, the dying industrial giant sprang back to life in mere months. The charts in the paper show a straight, vertical line of recovery dominating late 1938.
It is such a vivid, undeniable proof. You pass the law, the factory dies. You repeal the law, the factory comes back to life.
Which leads us to the ultimate reflection of this entire era. The grand, sweeping lesson of the Great Depression that, frankly, we are still failing to grasp today.
What is that grand lesson?
The authors argue that we must fundamentally separate two types of inflation in our minds. They might look the exact same on a price tag, but their mechanics are entirely different.
Demand-side inflation versus supply-side inflation.
Exactly. Let's use your engine metaphor again. Demand-side inflation happens when you devalue the currency, or print money, or increase government spending. It acts like stepping on the gas. It breathes life into exports. It creates new orders. It fuels a real expansion. People feel richer, so they buy more, so businesses hire more, and as a side effect, prices go up.
That's the good kind of heat in the engine. It's the engine running hot because it's going fast and doing work.
But supply-side inflation is a completely different beast. When you force artificial wage hikes without productivity gains, when you administratively cap working hours, when you have massive strikes, you are simply restricting the fuel line. You are making it harder and more expensive to produce the exact same amount of goods.
It's essentially a heavy, invisible tax on efficiency.
And that tax guarantees stagflation, stagnation of output, paired with inflation of prices.
Both dynamics cause prices to rise at the market. But one brings rain to a parched desert and grows crops, while the other turns a bustling factory into a rusted graveyard. This is the cold, brilliant mechanics of how the world actually works. It is not a debate about right-wing versus left-wing politics. It's about the physics of an assembly line. If you force a factory to pay 20% more money for 20% less work, the factory will simply stop making things, period.
And that is exactly why this 80-year-old microdata is so incredibly vital for us to understand today.
Which brings us perfectly back to the present moment. Because the authors didn't just dig this up for a history lesson. The implications for today's policymakers are massive.
We live in an era right now where nominal interest rates have frequently spent years hovering near zero. We have entire continents, particularly in Europe, that find themselves stuck in persistent low-growth traps. Does that economic environment sound familiar?
Eerily familiar.
Mm-hmm.
We are back at the zero lower bound.
Look around today. Open any major financial newspaper. What are the massive global calls we hear from various political movements and labor organizers?
We hear calls for rigid structural labor market interventions.
We see momentum building for forced, mandated 4-day work weeks without a loss of pay.
We see demands for administrative wage mandates that completely ignore productivity.
It is the exact same underlying rhetoric. If we just legally mandate that everyone works less, we can share the remaining jobs. If we just mandate higher pay by decree, everyone will be richer.
The authors of this paper leave us with a fascinating and frankly uncomfortable question. If the foundational macroeconomic models used by central banks around the world today still fundamentally misread how supply restrictions work in a downturn, are we at risk of repeating the devastating mistakes of 1936?
It is a warning we cannot afford to ignore. When we attempt massive structural labor interventions while relying on a broken mathematical compass, the results could be catastrophic.
For everyone listening, just imagine the rusted, abandoned factories of 1936 France overlapping as a ghostly projection onto the automated modern assembly lines of today. If our brightest central bankers are still relying on models that hallucinate a boom when they should be predicting a collapse, is it possible that the structural labor interventions we are debating right now could guarantee our next great stagnation? Something for all of us to think about the next time someone promises a legislative free lunch. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.